Dear students, previously we talked about wastewater microbiology and briefly about wastewater treatment. Now let's move on to solid waste microbiology. In our house, in our towns and in our industries, including our agricultural industry, wastewater is not the only form of waste that we generate. A large portion of our waste materials form the solid portion of the waste generated. Now, the solid portions might have certain biodegradable components which degrade biologically by microbes, or recalcitrant components that do not degrade, such as heavy metals. Over the time, the biodegradable components of the solid waste degrade, leaving the recalcitrant materials behind. Many a times, the recalcitrant materials are very toxic to the environment and for public health. Also, many of the daughter products of the biodegradation could be harmful for the environment or for public health. Overall, the solid waste, if not properly managed, maintained and treated, poses a big hazard to environment. A recent example would be the landfill landslide that caused 23 deaths in Sri Lanka and 2 deaths in Ghaziabad in India. Now, today in this lecture, we will start with solid waste management techniques and then briefly go into the major microbiological processes that drive degradation of solid waste. So, the municipal waste that is generated might consist of wood. So, these are the parts of the trees that have dropped down, let's say in storm, or have been cut. It could include paper. These are the output of educational institutions or offices. It will have metals, plastics, glass, food waste, yard waste. Yard waste is everything else we generate in the house, and then we have a portion of other. Now, this diagram is from a particular study that was done in an American town some 10 years ago. With different towns, cities and villages, the proportion of the different components of the waste, solid waste, would differ. For example, an industrial town that deals with dyes may have less amount of wood waste or yard waste. On the other hand, it is possible that a largely forest based village town will have more wood based and yard waste in the solid waste generated. So, this is variable, the percentages here would be variable, but overall there would be some consistency in the proportion of different components of solid waste generated for a particular cities and town. So, we notice that the components of the solid waste that are generated depend upon the demography of the place. A village will probably have lot of gobar or cow manure, buffalo manure, animal droppings that it would generate, compared to a city that will have higher number of metals, solvents, chemicals, household chemicals such as bleach, plastics. So it also depends on the economy. If it is a rural economy, we will see that the components of the waste reflect the waste expected from rural areas, and it also depends upon geography. So, a forest based village will have a very different waste composition compared to a river, a village that is adjacent to a river. So, these are few of the factors that affect the component of waste generated. Now, once the waste has been generated, the solid waste can be sent for landfilling, composting or vermicomposting. So, landfilling is basically deposition of the waste inside the land. Now, landfilling can be done in many types, and for major cities and towns across the world, landfilling serves as the most frequently used solid waste management practice. The other practice we have is of composting. Now, composting is very relevant for Indian villages and many Indian towns. The composting can be done in two ways. We can either have a decentralized composting mechanism, or we can have a centralized composting mechanism. Now, decentralized composting mechanism would look like every kitchen in the house or every house composting its own kitchen waste, and centralized would look like the compostable material, which compostable material is collected from every house and institution and then composted at a municipally controlled and governed composting site. Vermicomposting is when we use worms to metabolize our solid waste and convert them into compost. There are many advantages of vermicomposting over bacterial and fungal composting, which is mostly the default composting, and some of them are that they are low odor, they do not alter the pH dangerously, and they are very efficient in converting waste into compost. Now, these are some pictures from different Indian landfills. I will briefly talk about these two pictures. They are from Ghaziabad landfill. So, I live in Roorkee, and when I go to NCR, we drive through this landfill, and this is very important landfill for many purposes. Notice here that the waste has been piled up without any mechanism to make sure that the waste does not undergo a landslide like mechanism where the top waste goes down. So, there is no mechanism here to prevent the top waste from toppling down here. So, in case of an earthquake or in case of heavy downpour like happened recently, it is quite possible that this waste on the top will fall down like in a landslide like manner. So, this is not a very well maintained landslide, at least this portion of it is not very well maintained. Now, another thing I would like you to notice here is that how what a close relationship the flora, fauna and human beings have with our landfill sites. Now, most of these landfills are where they are the convergence point of the communities, cities, towns, districts waste, and as such, over time, when biodegradable components, which is mostly the food waste, when it degrades, what we are left with is often the recalcitrant and very toxic waste. So, whenever we have human beings in close commune with the landfill site, and which is not properly screened, which is not properly bound and not contained, then there is a very high risk that our animals, our birds and human beings would be exposed to dangerous amount of pollutants and will be affected. Now, the other thing I want you to notice, these are some other pictures of human beings undergoing a very close interaction with our landfill sites. And another thing I would like you to notice is that I have mentioned at least twice that the biodegradable component of the waste material that is put into landfill degrades over time. Now, if I am talking about degradation of biodegradable fraction, obviously it is the microbes that are doing the business. So, in this lecture we will briefly go over the microbiology of landfills, and in the next lecture we will elaborate more about them. The other thing I want you to notice in this particular slide is about the peculiar conditions of landfill in our country. The way a landfill looks and is maintained, operated in developed part of the world and in a developing country such as India are very different, and they warrant a closer look. So, for example, here we have rag pickers picking up the rags from the landfill site. I think this is again from NCR landfill, same landfill Ghaziabad. I'm not sure about it, but that's what I think because of the canal that's flowing from here and the city that is established here. Now, notice that not only are these rag pickers being exposed to toxic amount of waste, but they are also doing a very good business in pointing out to us that the waste that goes for landfilling in India is not properly segregated, and thus one of the major problems with our solid waste management is that we do not have good segregation practices. Now, segregation would include removing everything that can be recycled or repurposed before putting into landfill, and the advantage of this practice is that the volume of the land that requires or waste that requires to be filled inside the land reduces, and thus environmental impact reduces. So, instead of having giant mountains of waste, we have smaller manageable amount of waste piles. So, these rag pickers are probably finding a lot of glass and plastic that can be repurposed or recycled, and if we want our solid waste management to be successful in the country, it is very important that we learn and invent a sustainable, feasible method for segregating the waste. And it's now here's another landfill site, and I'm not sure where it is, but it's definitely in India, and you have children playing on a landfill site. This is extremely dangerous, and especially because children have growing bodies, thus their bodies absorb more nutrients, and whatever contaminant they are exposed to will last longer in their bodies. They have more, and their body organs are very active. The cells are rapidly growing, dividing, and thus they are more susceptible to developing diseases from exposure to contaminant. Another example I would like to give here is what happened in Bangalore a couple of years ago, was where they had poorly managed landfill sites. People noticed that on the ground above the landfill, because ideally what we do is we have landfills, and then this is above the ground landfill, but many a times landfills are done below the ground. So many a times landfills are actually below the ground. So basically we have ground level here, and we dig a trench, and in the trench we line it properly with a liner with sufficient impermeability to prevent any amount of toxic liquid that accumulates from the waste to percolate into the groundwater, and then we fill it with our waste. And when we fill it with our solid waste, eventually we seal it, and typically we try to grow garden here. And the reason why we want to grow gardens here is because more often than not, this is nutrient rich environment. The plants, trees help us create a positive feeling, and also help remediate many of the contaminants that can undergo phytoremediation. So in Bangalore, what people noticed was that where the landfill had been covered properly, so where the land had been covered, the landfill had been sealed, gases were coming out from certain holes. Now in the people, also the local residents, usually the economically and socially underprivileged people, unfortunately, they noticed that this gas is inflammable, definitely methane or some other inflammable organic gas, and they started using it for cooking. Now, okay, it sounds pretty sweet that they found gas coming out from the earth that they could use for cooking, but it highlights that the landfill was not properly maintained, the waste was not segregated, and lot of biodegradable components were allowed to be put in landfill. Typically, we don't want highly biodegradable compounds to go in the landfill. We want only the recalcitrant proportion to go. And there are many reasons why we would want that, because let's say initially we have filled the landfill with up to its maximum capacity and then sealed it from here. If it is biodegradable, over time the volume of the solid waste would reduce, and this volume would be covered by liquids which are leachates, and if they permeate into groundwater, they will destroy our groundwater, and then another portion of it would be gases. Now these gases would escape into the environment, as perhaps was happening in Bangalore, and then they will cause these are mostly greenhouse gases, so they will contribute to climate change, and they will also expose people. The other thing is that now we have wasted this particular volume, land is very precious in India, and we have wasted this entire volume that could have been used for putting recalcitrant solid waste. So this is, let's say, mildly biodegradable waste, but if I have very biodegradable, I might have a larger volume that is now lying waste after the gas has escaped and the leachate has been drained out, the liquid has been drained out. So it's very, very important for us to segregate our waste properly and make sure that what comes to landfill is often the recalcitrant waste, much like the plastic and aluminum cans you see here. Okay, now let's talk about landfill. Landfill therefore is for solid waste, the garbage, not very biodegradable portion, and solids that remain after waste treatment. So what the second part of this sentence is referring to is that the municipally collected solid waste must undergo a certain amount of pre-treatment before being dumped into landfill. So that would include sorting the waste. So we sort the waste. This is very important, waste segregation. It's economically not very attractive, and thus it requires mass public awareness and drive for people to sort their waste at home right away. So we sort the waste, we remove all the recyclables, repurposable, we remove these materials. We also separate the organic, rather biodegradable material, and then we are left with recalcitrant material. Now this recalcitrant material can go to landfill. The recyclable material should go to a recycle plant, and the biodegradable material should go for composting. Ideally, this is your ideal solid waste management practice. You have landfill, recycle and composting. And after sorting the waste, the recalcitrant material can undergo mechanical pulverization to reduce the size of solid waste. For example, let's say I have 1 gallon or 2 gallon milk can. So this is the size of my milk can. It's needlessly occupying the more volume than its actual solid material. So basically this is just a thin can. So if it undergoes mechanical pulverization, now it will occupy much lesser volume. So this is very important step. And then I have incineration. Certain parts of our waste need to be incinerated. Typical among them would be medical waste. Now dear students, think about it. Why do we want to incinerate our medical waste, and why do we not just want to put it into a landfill? Well, I hope you will arrive to the same conclusion, that medical waste can be a source for spreading more diseases, for example blood-borne pathogens, and also certain components of medical waste can cause other emerging contamination by, for example, certain pharmaceuticals are very bad for our health, cause endocrine disruption or cause antimicrobial resistance. So in medical waste, definitely we want to incinerate it. Then there could be also the leachate. Now this is a new term, and we will be dwelling quite some about on the leachate. Now the leachate is a liquid that over time develops in a landfill. And remember I was talking about the solid phase, liquid phase and gas phase. The liquid phase is in landfill is the leachate. Now I have seen certain landfills in India, after they collect the leachate, they condense it, they do different treatment for it to try to remove certain contaminants, and at the end of all the treatment, the solution they are left with is whatever waste you can't get rid of, you can't dispose it because it is very concentrated form of waste, then they incinerate it. The other advantage of incinerating so the other kind of waste we want to incinerate is high calorific or high calorie waste. So if the heat that would be generated by burning our solid waste is quite high, then we can actually use it as a source of thermal power, and then thermal power can be converted into electricity, and we can use that for running a landfill and maybe even supply to the electrical grid. So at least these three kind of waste we want to incinerate them. Okay, now let's look at landfill. The first one. Now there are two different kinds of landfills. We have cell emplacement, we have trench method, which is also the cut and fill method. So let's look about the cell emplacement method. In cell emplacement method, when we start making our land, we usually in both of the cases we end up with these cells. So you look here, this is a cell and a similar cell is here, but there is a big difference in which we are doing with the cell emplacement method. In cell emplacement method, we have dug up a large portion of the land and we fill and compact. So this is the filling of the waste that has been collected by waste collection truck. This is the bulldozer that's trying to compact the waste material, and then we'll put a cell mud cover over it and create the first cell, and then we'll add more waste, compact it, and we'll add another cell. We'll add more waste and then we'll compact it and we'll add earth layer to make another cell, and so on and so forth. This is the cell emplacement method. In trench method, what we do is we, instead of cutting a long big area of the ground, we cut a trench, and the trench is then properly lined. One thing that is not clear with these pictures is that we are not showing the lining very well. All these have to be lined. So very good lining material has to be added here, which will ensure that the liquids that will be generated in this waste do not end up contaminating the groundwater. Alrighty, so this is the trench method, this is the area method. Now coming to the microbiology of waste. Now what happens when the waste has been put in the either in the landfill generated by trench method or the landfill generated by cell emplacement method. Now there, in this particular waste that we are putting in the landfill, there are definitely some biodegradable fraction of it. No matter how well we sort our waste, there is a biodegradable fraction, and which will over time degrade into simple organics like methane, carbon dioxide, may even form some amount of water, and may form some other complex organic compounds. Oh yes, and they might even form water depending on the kind of degradation. So these materials will over time undergo degradation and form this, and they don't undergo all different kinds of possible biodegradation at the same time. So if you remember, in the initial lectures I talked about oxygen as being the best electron acceptor. So they undergo a sequential electron acceptor system. So best electron acceptor oxygen carries out the aerobic oxidation first, which is then followed by anaerobic oxidation, followed by methanogenesis, then decline of methanogenesis, and overall it ends up with stabilization of the landfill over time, which might take long time. We are talking geological scale here. So let's look here. Initially we start with aerobic phase. Now in aerobic phase what happens, we have plenty of oxygen available. Now this oxygen is consumed, so it falls down, and as oxygen gets depleted, the aerobic degradation of waste, also biodegradable waste, also decreases. So this is the first phase. First phase is the aerobic phase, and the typical characteristics of the aerobic phase are that the oxygen gets depleted and CO2 is formed, not methane but CO2. The other thing is that the pH often goes down. We also generate some amount of water and absolutely no amount of methane. The conditions are not right for methanogenesis. Alrighty, and we are noticing that nitrogen is also decreasing. Then enter the second phase, which is anaerobic acidic phase. Now anaerobic acidic phase, what we have is the pH falls down very rapidly. Now why is pH falling down very rapidly? Because now we are producing lot of acidic material. So and we have generation of carbon dioxide, and some hydrogen gas might also be generated. Again, no methane or very less methane, minimal methane, but the important thing is that the pH decreases. So basically this is the acidic phase of your reaction. The other important thing is that the leachate BOD and COD do not fall. Of leachate don't change much. Another thing is, whether it is the aerobic phase or acidic phase, in both phases the solids are not degrading. So let me rewind here. When we put our waste in a landfill, there is some water content in the waste itself. That water content over time and with pressure, with compaction, and with the pressure of the weight of the waste above it, it separates, and then we have the first kind of leachate that generates. So most of the aerobic degradation, acidic degradation is happening of wet or moist waste. The solids are not degraded. Now when we enter the phase 3 and phase 4, which is initial methanogenic phase and stable methanogenic phase, this is where most of the waste would be degraded. So in the initial methanogenic phase, which is anaerobic methanogenesis, now it's a very good time for me to clarify that there is a big difference in anaerobic and anoxic. So we have another word that we have used earlier, anoxic and anaerobic. So in both of them, oxygen is not present as oxygen itself. In anoxic, we will have other forms of oxygen present, such as sulfate or nitrate or nitrite, but in anaerobic even these are absent. So when even these are absent, then in anaerobic we will have fermentation. They don't use oxygen at all. We will have methanogenesis. So here we have anaerobic methanogenesis. This is typically unstable, but here this is where somewhere here is where your methane production peaks. So here look, the methane is increasing and it peaks. So this is the methane starts increasing, and this is where we get CO2. The CO2 to methane ratio gets nearly 50-50. So we have nearly 50% of carbon dioxide and 50% of methane. The other thing is that in the third phase, finally the BOD and COD of leachate is decreasing. They are decreasing, and the solids are also getting degraded. So the solid degradation is substantial, quite significant. Finally, we reach the stable methanogenic phases, where the CO2 to CH4 ratio is different, and in this particular case it looks like it might be 40-60 or something near that in the anaerobic methanogenesis stable phase. Here again the CO2 production falls down, it's less than CH4. We might still get some H2 production. This is where we have substantial or significant degradation of solid waste. The BOD and COD of leachate drop very much. So initially here the BOD to COD ratio of the leachate might be 9:10, and here by the time we come here, the BOD ratio with COD would be left as 1:1 nearly. So most of the biodegradable components have been biodegraded nearly. Okay, now this is not shown in the figure, but after the 4 phases we have another phase, the phase 5. Now the phase 5 can be called as the phase where complete stabilization takes place. This is a phase of complete stabilization, and what this happens in geological time scale. So we do not know if it's really happening, but we believe it happens. In this phase 5, the methane production falls down over long period of time, because this is geological time scale. Whatever we are talking about in scientific community is still theoretical. Humankind have not been present with this information long enough to see phase 5 come into fruition. Alrighty, so this is where your landfill is stabilized, and this is what we hope happens over time. Dear students, this is all for today. In the next lecture we will be talking more about degradation of leachate material and the microbes that are involved in degradation. Thank you very much.